Before we begin, let's take a moment to highlight a core value we all share across our industry: safety. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. The event of an emergency, please follow instructions from the staff and exit through the doors clearly marked with the exit sign and blinking right now. Kindly switch off or silence your mobile devices. Please note that this session is streamed and recorded. During the Q&A, simply raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. And for those active on social media, the official event hashtag is #EPCA59. We invite you to join the conversation. Finally, we would like to remind everyone of our EPCA do's and don'ts. As you're all aware, we must refrain from discussing any sensitive market information. Compliance with competition law is not just expected, it's one of EPCA's core values. And now, without further ado, let's begin.
Nice music. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session at EPCA, sponsored by Chemical Market Analytics by Opus, covering rebalancing in a fractured world. Of course, we all know where we're at today, and navigating in this new order as we go forward. So maybe a bit of background: who is Chemical Market Analytics and how do we fit into the grand scheme of things? So we are now in the family under Dow Jones. So you may be familiar with Dow Jones, Wall Street Journal, Factiva, Barron's, and then some other newly acquired businesses, Dragonfly, Oxford Analytics. And we're under the Opus umbrella, which is part of the energy acquisitions they've been making over the last 4 or 5 years. So we're happy to be here and part of this family. And under Opus, we really cover a wide spectrum of space in the market. So you can see from right to left, axis on the bottom, looking at energy and energy pricing within a broader Asia, petrochemical wires, doing PRA, price reporting, on a lot of markets, NGLs, olefins, as well as aromatics and others. McCloskey, our group, covering coal, metal, and mining, so we're covering that space. And then Chemical Market Analytics, looking from chemicals and energy all the way through feedstocks and on through derivatives. A little bit more about Chemical Market Analytics. We do comprehensive analytics on regional markets as well as country level. We look at actionable near-term analysis, looking at what's going on in the market today, whether that's logistics, whether that's operations of any given site. We are forecasting price, cost, and margin, and we're looking at capacity additions, supply, demand, and trade. So all the fundamentals that really drive our market. We have about 200 dedicated chemical experts around the world, so we do have boots on the ground in most geographies, and we're covering more than 350 chemicals. So our view from oil, gas, coal, all the way through to pellets and on through widgets is really an integrated perspective on how this market works. And we have long-term market outlooks, out to 2050 on all these components of cost, price, margin, supply, demand, trade. And we're soon to be extending that to 2060. Of course, most will ask, you don't really know what's going on 5 years from now, let alone 50 years. But you got to have a vision and got to look at all the dynamics that drive our industry. What we do in our company, we have research and insights, so really looking at all the details on the fundamentals, over 200 experts. We do bespoke work in our consulting group. Again, the beauty of our organization now is you're given one view all the way through the whole value chain, and it really brings a lot of value to be able to assess the markets like that. And we do conferences. So we have a World Chemical Forum as well as many other events, and a bit more on our World Chemical Forum coming up in March of next year, the 25th and 26th, to the Woodlands, Texas. So that's a bit north of Houston. And really, it's talking similar themes that we're talking about today: embracing the new reality, and how do I transform to survive in the long run. What's going to happen at the World Chemical Forum? Strategic foresight, really looking at a lot of drivers in the industry, the rigorous analysis, the problems that we're all facing. A lot of our colleagues have had their feet in your shoes. They know the challenges you're going through. We have a new product called the Chem Energy 360. It's really a playbook on looking at supply-demand fundamentals in 40 of the key markets that we think will drive this industry. And it really gives you, more of an elevator speech, but high level, here are the big issues that we see and probably you're seeing. And broader visibility with a lot of networking going on, expecting over 600 delegates, 65 plus speakers, both internally and externally. So it should be really a good time to get out with people to really understand what's going on in our space. So again, rebalancing in a fractured world. We all know, we have issues with tariffs. We had energy dynamics. We have conflicts, pandemics, geopolitics and policies changing, and definitely sanctions. There's a term out there, VUCA, our team talks about that a lot. It's about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. One of our colleagues will talk a bit more about that. So, how do I manage in this world today as we have all these challenges in front of us? But we know we have to really be thinking about the long term. We're an industry that has, high capital intensity. We have long lead items, to build and add capacity around the world. And we have various shareholder, stakeholder concerns. How do we put all those together in a world that really is difficult to even be thinking about, investments in the long term, but you can't forget about it. So here we'll share, thoughts from the colleagues as listed in the agenda. We'll talk about energy trilemma, a bit about geopolitical instability, beyond the trough, where are we going? How do we see the world on economics? Demand disruptors, really important as people are looking for ways to add value. Europe, definitely we're here in Europe, and rationalizations, how do we see those playing out? A bit on China, self-sufficiency. You can't talk about the globe unless you talk about China. And then lastly, with the time remaining, we'll have a panel discussion. We'll just kind of banter a bit amongst us on a few questions that we've formulated that will just add a bit to the content that's being delivered. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague Carlo Barassa, and he'll touch on energy trilemma. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning. So I have the distinct pleasure to present a lot on the geopolitics, the macroeconomic economic situation, as well as energy. And so the way this presentation is going to evolve is I'll give you a short-term outlook on the primary energy products, which would be oil and gas, as well as a summary of what the macroeconomic situation is as a result of the trade uncertainty. Then what I'll do is I'll talk extensively about the energy trilemma and how the world evolves over the next few years. So I like to use a lot of quotes to set the stage when I present, and this is a really good quote that I think encapsulates what the world is going through today. Life is not a matter of holding good cards, but playing a poor hand well. And there have been a lot of good cards dealt over the past few decades in geopolitics, the economy, and energy. But over the last 5 years, I would argue that there have been a lot of poor hands that have been dealt to a number of countries around the world. And primarily, it's been due to the foreign policy of the United States and really driving this change in the world order. And so we do see an environment where we are evolving from a globalized world where there was unfettered trade and movement of goods as well as services. But now we're moving to an environment that's more isolationist in nature, where a lot of the countries are saying, hey, what's in it for me? Definitely what's in it for their own local economies and their own populaces. And so when we look at the various factors that are contributing to this isolationism, especially as it relates to oil, OPEC countries are seeking to boost production. In other words, they're looking to roll back the voluntary cuts that primarily do from Saudi Arabia, but a number of countries also did some voluntary cuts. But also the President of the United States wants to promote U.S. supply growth. Unfortunately, there's still this mantra of capital discipline within the states. And then also, just given a lot of the trade uncertainty, demand concerns still persist within the oil environment. And so when we're looking at global trade, this is really the topic du jour. And so you heard from the previous session about a number of the challenges that we see, not only trade between the European Union and the United States, but also trade with China and a number of Asian countries. And then let's not forget that there's still a number of conflicts going on in the world, namely Iran and Israel, as well as Russia, Ukraine. So I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how trade barriers and trade tariffs have affected the economic situation. And so when we look at the chart on the left, the effective tariff rate that we're projecting going forward is a tariff rate that we haven't seen in about 100 years, right? So it really is changing the dynamic of trade around the world. And then when we look at the economic outlooks, when you look at the bars, the first and the third bar are the 2025 and 2026 economic outlook as it was in March, and now the second and the fourth bar are the economic outlooks as it is here in the most recent forecast in August. And what we see is growth is essentially flat between the two forecasts for the world. And in fact, it's doing much better in certain regions and certain economies. But unfortunately, when we look at the most recent forecast, we're actually seeing a decline in global growth in 2026. And that's a direct result of these trade tariffs that will be enacted here shortly. A little bit about the oil markets. There's been a lot of discussion about oil supply glut. But what I would argue is that that supply number that you see on the chart on the left, again, this is year-over-year growth in supply versus the chart on the right, which is year-over-year demand growth. What I would argue is that there is some slack in the system, especially in the non-OPEC barrels that are slow to arrive. And also there's some debate as to whether we are below 1 million barrels a day of demand growth or above 1 million barrels a day of demand growth. So by and large, there is going to be some oversupply in the market, and there will be pressure on prices as we move forward. Really quickly on natural gas, this is the big story in the next 5 years, is the amount of gas that will be on the water. And it's primarily driven by the North American buildup in LNG capacity, as well as the Middle East buildup in North American capacity. And that accounts for well over 50% of the amount of gas that will be trading on the water. So it'll be a good time to be in the gas business, but it also will be good for a consumer because there's a lot of molecules that'll be seeking homes. And then here's the segue into the long-term view that we want to put forward. And really, it's about the energy trilemma, which is sustainability, affordability, and security. And I would argue that over the last couple of decades, there was an overemphasis on sustainability. But just given all of the turmoil and all of the trade uncertainty, we're now starting to move over into affordability and security. And so that is paramount for a lot of legislators when they're looking to enact policy on energy matters. And so as we look at the long-term oil outlook, I like this quote by Charles Schultz. He's the creator of the Peanuts gang, you know, Snoopy and Charlie Brown. And so he said, "Sometimes I lie awake at night and ask, where have I gone wrong? Then a voice says to me, this is going to take longer than one night." And I think that's very apropos for the long-term oil outlook, because it is going to take a lot longer than what most people have thought about initially. And really, there are two key reasons why the long-term outlook will take longer. And primarily, it's going to be because of the entrenched hydrocarbon demand environment. We've essentially built up over the last 150 years this infrastructure that is leveraged to hydrocarbon, and especially when we talk about petrochemicals. I have this saying that it's hard to remove the petro out of petrochemicals, and that's really appropriate in this situation. And we're also looking at more polarization and less collaboration, as I've already mentioned in the previous slides. And so that's really going to slow down the energy transition. The other thing that I would argue is when you're looking at a total energy view, more people, more increased GDP is going to lead to more energy uses. And really, there's going to be a buildup of energy over time. Clearly, renewables will take, will have a role and will continue to grow its presence in the energy stack. But also, natural gas will grow in its role in the global energy demand environment. And oil will be relatively flat. And so this is the last slide that I want to leave you with as we look at oil demand in the future. And we actually ran two scenarios. One where the global refining environment doesn't add any capacity, and it really constrains the amount of feedstocks as we move forward. And that's the chart on the left. But then when we look at an unconstrained feedstock environment, especially what's in our balances, then it really begs the question, are we going to need more refining capacity? The answer is yes. It will no longer be driven by transport fuels, but it'll be driven by petrochemical demand. And you can see the chart on the right as the feedstock share will grow from 10% today to around 20% of oil demand. And this is significant because if we're going to add more refining capacity as an industry, then it's going to be more capacity that is designed to provide feedstocks, and that is essentially crude oil to chems facilities. And so in the last 30 seconds, I'll leave you with these 4 key points, right? From an economic perspective, trade policy changes are really causing a lot of instability, and it's really driving the world from globalization to isolationism. And as a result, on the long-term energy, if I can skip to the 4th point, there's really going to be less collaboration on climate initiatives. But really, the key messages on oil and gas, there will be a glut that could deepen the as a result of the economic malaise. But then gas, there will be robust LNG supply on the water, and it'll be good for consumers. And lastly, as I'll reiterate, long-term energy, it's really entrenched hydrocarbon infrastructure that is going to delay this energy transition. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Raheel Shafi. He leads our global chemical consulting business, and he'll talk to you more about this geopolitical instability. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. Great presentation. And kind of you'll see a theme through much of our work, really, with respect to the geopolitics, going through all the value chains, etc. Carlos talked to you about the outlook for energy, but obviously with petrochemicals, that's our key business. Petrochemicals obviously are critical to our daily lives. It's critical to the planet, and it's a very key industrial sector. It's a sector where there's a lot of global trade, and we can see that from looking at all of these value chains. So one of the key things that Steve mentioned, obviously, is the 350 chemicals that Chemical Market Analytics actually studies in detail on a routine basis. If we look at all of the building blocks, chlorine, ethylene, propylene, aromatics, and methanol, and we add up every molecule and we look at a forecast, we can see that the global trade requirement for these building blocks is going to increase from about 280 million tons to about 380 million tons over the next 15 years, which is quite a big increase, about 35% increase. And in comparison, if you look at previously about 25 years ago, that was about half. So we're going to have a really significant area of growth, period of growth going forward. And when we look at that, it's critically linked to the fact that we do have less globalization in trade as well. So really I wanted to unpack a little bit why that globalization in trade has changed. So historically, much of trade was governed by the World Trade Organization rules-based WTO system. But after the paralysis of the appellate body in 2019, countries moved towards national strategies and regional frameworks to govern trade. And we've seen a number of frameworks come about, especially in Asia, I would say, where you have CPTPP and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And what we see is that a large proportion of trade actually occurs, especially within the Asian region, and there's a lot more regional integration and trade between each of the countries. This enables, the partnerships kind of enable the members to provide lower tariffs to each other, which is particularly useful at a time of low margins within the petrochemical industry. I think the other point that's important is that there's still bilateral agreements which are proceeding and proceed, will continue to proceed. You can see some of them listed here on the right-hand side. But trade agreements don't happen in isolation. They're shaped by geopolitics. And arguably, we could start this this journey through this graphic in the East or in the West. But I think the one thing that's critical is that they are interlinked. Okay. In the US, we see that the new administration's path is pretty clear and determined. The aim is to bridge deficit and reverse trade imbalances through tariffs. There's also a sustained effort to bring production back home and reshore investment. Europe's kind of on a different path, right? There we're looking at revitalizing manufacturing. That's one of the key things that we keep hearing through the course of EPCA. We all know the headwinds facing West Europe, and one of my colleagues will be talking about those. But I think the other point is that we do see portfolio pruning and kind of some closures and asset sales, which will be, which are already underway. A key part of the supply picture is obviously the GCC. I haven't named Middle East here. It is specifically the GCC that we're talking about. And we do see that the GCC will continue to have and pursue G2G arrangements, government-to-government arrangements, especially with economies in Asia, as it seeks to ensure that hydrocarbon molecules go from the GCC out to the markets in the form of petrochemicals or fuels, but increasingly in the form of petrochemicals. And India, obviously critical to global demand as well, is going to be relying on its global demand to encourage foreign direct investment. That's a key part of it. But we'll also be neutral and versus choosing a side. And you can see not particularly far away from India, you've got China, and we've got the talk about China coming up in one of the other presentations by one of my colleagues. But the key here will be, developing domestic demand, which has not really kept up with the supply, as was planned by People's Party. So yeah, just looking at how all of this comes together from a petrochemicals perspective. Well, all of these regions are interconnected. They're all going to depend on each other. We still need to balance global trade. Here, what I've got on this graphic is, again, it's all of the building blocks. So it's chlorine, ethylene, propylene, aromatics, and methanol. So all of the building blocks, again, it goes back up to the demand for all the 350 chemicals that we actually monitor. And you can see that supply is the yellow line, red is demand, and the difference is you can see whether the region is actually going to be export or import. And here what you can see is obviously the US is going to continue to be export. The other point to note here is that the scales are different. So the left-hand side, left y-axis is different. The best way to demonstrate that is to look at China, where we've got very different scale Obviously, the growth since 2000 has been astronomical, really, and changed the face of petrochemicals. But it's still going to be an importer net over the forecast period. United States will continue to be an exporter, obviously cost advantaged. Europe will develop into a slight net import position as we start to see, the fact that the cost advantages, et cetera, and rationalization will take an impact on supply. And Middle East, obviously key to balancing demand as well, so having a really important role, especially for volumes going to Asia. Reciprocal tariffs, so I mean, there's a lot to say in tariffs, and yet there's, I could be wrong tomorrow with what changes, but essentially the impact of tariffs has been felt with lower volumes of petrochemicals going from the US to China, and a more regional trade within Asia on petrochemicals specifically. It has impacted the US. Obviously, there has been signs where the labor market is weaker in the US recently. I think the other point that's important is that if the US wants to continue to have very high operating rates, then it is going to need and seek China as a future market. So, although people will be increasingly looking at applying reciprocal tariffs, it does manifest itself in different trade flows, and we're seeing evidence of that. One of the really important points about that is that, our experts really, there's so much tacit knowledge that we have as an organization as these tariff changes happen and trade flows change. Speaking to our experts on a regular basis is really important, and it's always educational for me as well to touch base with them. So it's more important now than it has been ever to be able to draw on that expertise and tacit knowledge that CMA has. We're going to have a full session on China from one of my colleagues, but essentially, the push for 5% growth is going to hinge on domestic consumption. Supply is comparatively easy, I guess, to build, but domestic consumption more so, more difficult. And you can see that, historically, we look at this graphic here. You've got four years here, but you can see that retail sales starting to decline, and yet relying on exports to go up in 2024. And then you have the obvious recent development has been the real pressures that we're seeing on the real estate market in China as well. So there is a real concern about how we actually forecast China with respect to GDP and the intrinsic economy and economic growth within China. And it's somewhere that we're doing a lot of work on within the company as well. I just want to summarize then. Yeah, I mean, international trade is vital for chemical commodity growth. G2G driven multilateral, bilateral trade agreements are on the rise as countermeasures against the WTO dispute resolution mechanism falls away. And you're going to hear it again and again, geopolitics really key to looking at how we forecast the future as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Nick Kovitz, who's going to be talking about some of the changes in profitability in petrochemicals.
So thanks, Raheel. I'm going to take a different perspective in this presentation, sort of take a step back, a more macro view, and say, beyond the trough, entering the next phase of the game, what does the next cycle look like? So to start off, I've got a couple questions, couple of key fundamental questions. Well, what is a market trough? How do we get here? And when are we going to exit? So I don't want to offend anyone from my picture of the cows here, but I moved to Texas 8 years ago, and I saw my first cattle farm. And ever since then, whenever I hear the word trough, I get this image in my mind. I cannot get rid of it. And we hear a lot of it today. So I want to take a more basic view and look at the commodity cycle. I think we all know the trough, that's the part in the middle, that's the bottom. But what's in the trough? Is it margins? Is it operating rates? Is it demand? Well, I'll give you a spoiler, it's a little bit of everything. But we're going to look here on this curve at margins, because ultimately that drives reinvestment in the chemical sector. So starting on the left here, we'll start at the top of the curve. This is peak operating rates, peak margins. This is when producers start to reinvest in the market, make reinvestment decisions. It's a bit of a challenging time for buyers because, of course, you have high input costs. But as we say, the solution to high prices is high prices. We see substitution, we start to see optimization, and we see slower demand growth. Now, just as that demand growth is slowing, we start to see that new capacity coming online, and that pushes into the supply overhang and into the trough of the market. Now, in that trough of the market, that new capacity, that low-cost capacity, it wants to run. So it lowers the average cost, and that pushes the higher-cost producers into the profitability concern point, and you can have rationalizations or supply curtailments because any rational producer is not going to operate at a loss. So now you have operating rates moving up, low prices are stimulative to buyers, and you start to see increasing demand, and you start moving up the cycle again. And then as pricing power takes hold, we get a structurally tighter market balance, and we get to the top and repeat the cycle again. But there's a trap. I say there, this time it's different. It's a dangerous trap because these cycles are long. And yes, the next cycle might be different, and we're going to look at that today, but it is still going to be a cycle. So then the question of when are we going to get out of the trough? Well, it's a bit of a trick question because I'm not going to give you the answer. It's a bit difficult to answer that on a broad spectrum because it really depends on the value chain. If you look here at the base chemical value chains we cover, and we've talked about today already, we have capacity utilization and we have cash margins on the right. And you see, for the most part, these value chains are in the trough, but they're at different stages. Some are just entering the trough, some are in the middle, some are close to leaving the trough. But if you want to know by value chain, we've got our suite over at the Pullman Hotel down the road where we have all of our experts from these value chains who can give you detailed outlooks for when we expect them all to come out of the trough. But what drives us out of the trough ultimately is demand. It moves us through the commodity cycle. And at its most basic level, what drives demand? Well, it's people. People consume goods, goods consume chemicals. So as long as we're making more people, we're going to need more chemicals. So these two charts here, they look quite similar. The one on the left is the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, and the one on the right is our 10-year outlook. But if you look at the slopes, that's the rate of change. You see that line at the top, the blue line, total population, the slope is declining. That means the rate of population growth is slowing down. Now, it's not uniform across all age groups. That green line at the bottom, that's over age 64, that's actually increasing. So positive for medical and pharmaceuticals. But a concerning one is that light blue line. That's the age 0 to 14. That's actually in decline. So if we think longer term, by the end of the century, this cascades through, we eventually hit peak population. But we're not going to talk end of the century today. We're looking really the next 10 years. So the good news is population is continuing to grow. So as population grows, we think economic activity also increases, and a good yardstick for that is GDP. And not surprisingly, with slowing population growth, we also see slowing GDP growth. Yes, it continues to grow, but at a slower rate year over year. But that rate of decline is slowing down. We're approaching more of a plateau. So the outlook eventually is for slower but steady growth. And chemical producers, we like steady growth. But a key point of that is we have different markets. So advanced economies consume lots of goods. Emerging markets are moving towards advanced economies. Developing economies are moving towards emerging markets. And as we transition, a key difference is we have increasing per capita demand. So chemical demand per capita as economies advance increases. And in fact, if we look at the slope of these two lines, while they both look similar, the slope is increasing, meaning that rate of per capita demand increase accelerates. And when you put it all together, this results in a net increase in chemical demand. Yes, it is slowing down, that year-over-year rate of increase, and it matches GDP. In the long run, we do approach potential parity, but chemical demand growth is continuing to grow. So what does that mean for our basic theoretical cycle? Well, if we recall, we got our basic up and down. If our demand is growing at a slower rate, what does that do to the cycle? Well, in theory, it stretches it out. So this means a longer cycle, a potentially longer trough. That's the red line shown here. But demand isn't the only thing that's changing. So I went back to our capacity database. I looked at 4 decades of new capacity incremental growth. As each new plant in each of the value chains was brought on, what we see, shown on the left there, is each new plant that gets built after each decade is larger and larger. That makes sense. If we want to build new capacity, we want low-cost capacity. Building a bigger plant spreads our fixed costs across more tons. But as we build these bigger plants, it exceeds the demand growth and potentially puts us into the green curve here, where we see a larger oversupply, and because they're lower cost plants, they can run at lower cost, which pushes the trough level down further. So steeper troughs. This also accentuates the extended trough outlook because you have a larger capacity implemented that has to be absorbed by demand. Then finally, when I looked at that capacity database going back 40 years, I looked at how many new plants are being built versus how many chemical companies are there. And what we see is another trend of increasing consolidation. And this continues, and we expect this will continue in some regions. Some of the more emerging markets are more ripe for consolidation versus more of the advanced economies that are more consolidated today. But the net effect of this is when you reach the cycle peak, you've got less companies looking at potential investment, which could result in hesitation and potentially higher margins. Maybe it's not different, but again, with that longer chemical cycle, it is still a cycle. It might be different in shape, but it will still go up and down. So don't fall into the "it's different this time" trap. So this was our old curve. We talk about the evolving cycle. Our new curve, it's a little more challenging ride. It's still survival of the fittest. It's got steeper declines, potential overcorrections. We've got longer troughs, deeper troughs, higher peaks. But as the saying goes, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So we will still have a cycle. It just will look a little bit different next time. So next, I'd like to invite my colleague, Kaushik Mitra. He's going to talk about those demand disruptors. This is what's changing that demand outlook going forward. Kaushik?
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about demand disruptors, and as you all know, that we are going through a period of intense disruption in our life, in the world, and it looks like, there has been a intense activity around disruption, how they are really reshaping our life and our world. So I'm going to talk about how it's going to change our plastic world, what the data shows about the scale and amplitude of the disruption that is defining our world, and what companies can really do about to manage disruption and how they cope about and reflect on demand disruption. So the list is very long. As you know, we have supply chain bottlenecks, we have the pandemic, we have the high drama around tariffs, we have protectionism, we have bilateral deals which are kind of disrupting the flow for the rest of the world. So these are some of the things that we need to really absorb and see how it reflects on our business and how it is going to change the way we do our business and conduct ourselves. So why should companies actually take disruption very seriously? This is because we are living in a very interconnected world, and a small amount of disruption somewhere around the world really has a big rippling and cascading impact across the globe. So just to give you an example, when the attacks in the Red Sea started on various ships and vessels, a small factory in Austria got stocked out because their material didn't arrive. last month, there was a cyber attack actually in one of the leading producer of luxury vehicles in Europe and world, in fact, in one of the factories, and all their factories, actually production sites across the world, stopped working. And this has been since 5 weeks that the plants have not restarted. And it has led to big dislocation in terms of the suppliers of plastic components to all those plants, starting from China to India to Brazil to Slovakia. All the plants are really struggling to cope with these problems. Disruption is causing strategic missteps. It is causing miscalculation in how we conduct our businesses. We have to really reorient and reorganize ourselves very quickly. And this is something which is also leading to some of us missing the opportunities in the market. So when the pandemic broke out, we saw that despite having licenses to manufacture face masks in Europe, the production wheel of the companies could not be changed very rapidly, and as a result, we saw huge imports coming from China. So disruption also throw up opportunities which we need to be very agile about and to seize them in time. So we have been actually studying diligently the disruption and what really impacts the markets, and we have figured out that they are causing deep structural changes in the industry, and which has got a very long-term impact in terms of demand dislocation, in terms of supply imbalances. So fundamentally, we feel that from a macroeconomic side, there are changes which are happening, which has very far-reaching impact on our demand developments. The macroeconomic factors, the GDPs and others, we see the factor components are shifting more towards services, away from manufacturing and farming, so it has a very deep impact in terms of demand development. We also see that demographic shifts are happening, so the Western or affluent countries are becoming depopulated because of fertility rates, and it has a big impact because there is a huge correlation between income level and consumption of plastics. Supply chain dislocation in an interconnected world is really impacting a lot of people because the dependencies are really stretching as the supply chains are stretching around the world. So one small dislocation is really having a cascading impact in different parts of the world. Efficiency is another factor which is also changing quite rapidly. Frugality is becoming the norm. I mean, in that sense, plastic has been at the forefront of weight loss program, if you will, since for a long time. If you look at the carrier bags or freezer bags or snack packaging, the weight reduction in the last, let's say, 10 years have been to the extent of 25 to 30%. And with the changes in material sciences and in terms of technology, in terms of catalysts, we see the evolution happening constantly, and this is going to happen and continue in their path. So there will be some impact on the demand because of that. And of course, sustainability is a headwind or tailwind depending on your perspective. So it is also changing the way we do business, we do our business models, and especially in Europe, this is a very, very big topic, although we have seen that some slowdown in terms of sustainability moves in recent times. But overall, the overarching goals of net zero and others are continuing. So these are going to have a very, very significant impact in the way we do conduct our business and how the demand factors are going to move around. So we tried to translate all these disruptive factors into numbers, and we saw that there is a huge disruption in terms of demand contraction that has happened over time. And this is going to carry on till in the next 15 years. And this is very, very significant. And this is because had the disruption really not taken place, we have seen the operating rate in the industry would have been significantly higher. So that means the markets would have been much more balanced than what they are right now. And that, if you look from the other side, had the industry not miscalculated and put in so much of investments on the ground in the last 5 years and continue to do for the next few years, the industry would have been in a much healthier state. So our point is that we need to really take disruption into account. whenever doing strategic planning, investment planning. And these are some of the scenarios we need to build in order to time our investment properly so that we can capture the upside in a more smarter way. This is really showing what disruption really had impact across the globe, different geographies, different economic scales, and different, let's say, stages of economic development. And we see that the disruption really had impact across the globe in different regions, different economies. And the scale of impact was basically a function of the size. So China had really enormous impact in terms of dislocation of various factors. And as a result of that, we see that overall growth level, which I will show you in the next slides, are quite different than what we had anticipated. And now the conventional wisdom is that people speak about the Chinese domestic market, real estate sector, lack of investment. Those are actually impacting. But we also have figured out that China's export-driven growth, which was powering the growth and momentum in the last few decades, is slowing down, even as other emerging and developing countries like India, Southeast Asian countries are basically copying the Chinese model of produce and export. But that is going to take time. China is so big and it is so significant that for other emerging and developing markets, it's going to take time to displace China and emerge as a strong contender. And this is really amplified in this picture. So you see that China has been at the forefront of the overall growth for the last 20, 25 years. And its impact has been very, very significant, especially in the decade between 2010 and 2020. It far surpassed the other emerging and developing markets. But now, as China is starting to slow down, other markets are sort of ramping up. They're sprinting ahead. But it is going to take still another 10, 15 years before countries like India and other emerging countries to really match China, even at a diminished level. So this is very significant factor that we talk about the decline of China, plateauing of China, but China is going to be a force to reckon with even in the future. As for different markets are concerned, plastics are used in different markets, and especially in industry, if you really look at, there are diversity which is incomprehensible in the sense that you have building construction, you have industrial sectors, you have mobility, you have utilities, you have healthcare sector, so very, very diverse application base. But if you really look at disruption and the disruptive impact on demand factors, it is very important for the industry to really focus on research and development and new product application sourcing, because you can investing and evolving in terms of applications and new product development, you can mitigate the impact of disruption. So if we translate the disruption and see how much the impact has been, so there has been, as I said earlier, there has been huge impact in terms of, let's say, foregone profits, or in terms of lower operating that we see now. We see the prolonged, trough that has impacted the market, and we are going to recover, but it's going to take longer. So lower for longer is what we say conventionally. And even by 2040, we are not going to reach the expected level, which was sort of thought of a few years back. So this is very, very significant. And what we feel is that had the industry really listened and heard about the coming disruption that was being talked about since last 7, 8 years, and really scaled down or scaled back or readjusted the investment flow, the overall downturn would have been far lesser. So it is very important for the industry to look at the scenario building, the risk management part, and that is very, very critical. But at the same time, we also see that the industry is, even as it is consolidating, there is a big drive to really change and really prepare itself for the next act. Because plastic growth, as we heard from my colleagues, is going to remain. It's going to be significantly more in terms of demand in the next few years, and despite the disruption, is going to be a force to reckon with. So eventually what is going to happen is that companies has to focus on, of course, the strategies to become more stronger, more agile and resilient, but also they have to look at upgrading product portfolio, they have to look at niche markets So there I would like to speak about a couple of markets which are very interesting from a point of view of differentiation in terms of value creation. So these are some of the products which are basically thought to be product of the future. They're niche markets, they offer differentiation, and they have given the companies that are invested very good competitive advantage. So these are some of the things that you would like to take note and basically explore investing. So to end my presentation, I would like to say that disruption is going to significantly alter the way plastic industry really evolves. The question is, how do we really seize the opportunity and really redefine the future? Otherwise, we risk being at the wrong side of the history. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Duncan to talk about European consolidation.
Good morning, everyone. So, last 5 years, to say that the European industry has been going through some difficult times is an understatement. We've had COVID in 2020, which affected demand and changed working practices. Then we had the Russia-Ukraine energy inflation issue, and then more recently, the economic downturn combined with global excess capacity. Plants across Europe are rationalizing at a faster rate than ever before, and everybody's wondering who's going to be next. Cefic co-authored a paper at the beginning of this year talking about the competitiveness of the European industry, highlighting some of the challenges, but also addressing some action points that I'd like the European Commission to focus on. In my presentation, I'll share chemical market analytics view of the European chemical industry for the next 15 years from certain perspectives to see whether we're kind of heading deeper into the trough or there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I think the first question we should ask is, how robust is the European petrochemical industry? I think you're all very familiar with the strategies recommended to achieve sustained superior business performance by Michael Porter in his book, Competitive Advantage, and Michael Tracy and Fred Wiersma, their book, The Discipline of Market Leaders. And I kind of group these together to give three options. One is cost advantage or operational excellence, customer intimacy or focus, and product leadership or differentiation. So what elements of the petrochemical industry should we look at in achieving these strategies? Well, first of all, we've got the energy and raw material costs. These obviously represent more than 75% of petrochemical costs in some products. Integration, increasing efficiency in supply chain and logistics. If you can co-locate production of chemicals in the same value chain, you can eliminate transportation costs. You've got production efficiency through scale and capital expenditure, obviously an impact on fixed cost per ton. And then you've got the regulatory framework, the cost of doing business in Europe. Other aspects to consider would be proximity to market. If you can, load your facility with a lot of local customers, you can improve your net back. And then customer loyalty, long-term relationships built over reliable supply, prompt supply, local inventory, innovation, sometimes even integration. And then finally, we've got technical advantage, new product development, and even process improvements. So let's have a look at some of these aspects in more detail, see how the European industry has been doing. You're all very familiar with the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis in 2022. There was a scramble to replace lost Russian pipeline gas through imports, primarily from the US, North Africa, the Middle East, a bit more from Norway through the pipeline. Unfortunately, a lot of these imports, liquefied natural gas, are now carrying liquefaction and transportation costs. So after the initial crisis, prices have settled down approximately double the level that they were historically in Europe. And this creates a structural cost disadvantage because now gas pricing in Europe is 3 to 4 times higher than it is in the US or the Middle East. And we can see that in terms of cash cost of production on the right here. So we've got cash cost of production in green for Europe relative to blue in the United States, starting off with 2020. You can see at this point, actually, the gas prices were very low because of COVID, and there's relatively limited difference. Typically, Europe is slightly more costly than the US. But fast forward to 2025 and today's gas prices, suddenly these differentials have expanded quite dramatically. And that really prevents Europe from exporting materials easily to these other low-cost markets. But it also makes Europe a lot more sensitive to imports as well, exposed to imports. If we look at gas pricing, our gas price forecasts for the next decades, we can see we are expecting a reduction, largely due to the liquefaction capacity that's coming on stream that Carlo mentioned. But over time, that will fill up, and there will also be a rise in US domestic gas price. So Europe's gas price will rise again on a long-term basis. Looking at plant scale then. So on this chart, we're looking at the average size of plant for these particular chemicals in Europe versus the other regions. Europe is in green. And you can see in pretty much all of the cases, Europe has a significant size disadvantage relative to its competitors. And that's largely due to the age of some of the assets in Europe, not much investment over the last 30 years. And potentially, originally the plant was designed to be integrated into a refinery petrochemical complex where there was a certain limitation on feedstock availability and downstream derivative capacity. And this will increase the fixed cost per ton of production. Bear in mind, these are only average plant sizes for each of the regions, so we're not talking about the world scale plants, which are even larger, and these are typically coming online in places like mainland China, the Middle East, and to some extent in the US as well. And some of these new plants actually have improved processes as well, so even variable costs could be lower for the new facilities. What about the demand side of then, the proximity of local market? On the left-hand side, we're showing the market size for these particular chemicals in Europe, starting in 2019, the last kind of normal year before COVID. And then if we compare that to the yellow bar, which is 2025's demand, you can see in the majority of cases, we're at least 15% lower. And that's largely because of weak consumer confidence, higher interest rates affecting some of the key markets like construction, and also more imports of finished goods from overseas. If we take the car market, for instance, I think everybody's familiar with how popular Chinese electric vehicles have become. And that fundamentally weakens petrochemical consumption in the region. And then obviously more recently we've had the tariff situation in terms of the US. If we look out to 2030 and 2040, we do expect some recovery in some of these markets. But as you can see, many of them don't really recover, in our view, to the 2019 demand level. So that does require some restructuring of capacity in the region. Another very worrying feature is the role of imports, and we can see that on the right-hand side. So we're looking at the percent imports in terms of Western European demand. And over the last several years, we've seen a quite significant ramp-up of the importance of imports relative to Western European demand, which is obviously weakening local production, putting local plants at a lower operating rate, and that's increasing their fixed cost per ton as well. 2030, 2040, unfortunately, we see these imports either stabilizing at a high level or in some cases even accelerating further. So what about integration? So obviously the concept of chemical production sites, chemical hubs or parks has been well recognized in Europe for many years, the BASF famous Verbund strategy. The problem is when a plant closes at a site, then this can expose weaknesses in the rest of the facilities which are left. Shared utility costs can often go up. You maybe have to import feedstocks or export intermediate products. So you're adding transportation costs as well. And that can certainly weaken the other plants. In the last few years, we've seen 3.2 million tons of ethylene capacity announced for closure, which is about 14% of total capacity across Europe. Another 1.1 million tons is slated for closure by 2027. After decades of slow refinery closures, There's been a ramp-up of announced closures or conversions in the last few years, another 14 refineries representing 1.3 million barrels per day of crude distillation unit capacity. So these refineries and steam crackers are really the key plants to provide fuel products and the building blocks for the downstream chemicals. So when we start to add on some of the aromatics plant closures, the polyolefins, and the ECUs, it's not surprising that we see a lot of the closures that are at the same sites as these refineries or steam crackers. So it's absolutely critical to maintain the competitiveness of these chemical clusters. So a pretty bleak picture so far. So what is to be done? Well, the CEFIC paper basically called for action, and that's what the European Commission has developed, an action plan in July of this year, which touches on many of the issues that we've talked about. So identifying and protecting critical production sites, identifying strategic molecules for downstream industries, monitoring trade a lot more carefully, protecting the European market from unfair trade practices, giving grants for decarbonisation of energy and trying to create affordable energy for industry, focus on creating leading new markets in the area of sustainability, recycling, and also simplifying the regulatory framework. So it's positive the European Commission has identified that the chemical sector is in a crisis. The difficulty is how quickly will this action plan be implemented, and how deep does the support go to protect the existing industry, whether it will be ramping up in time. So the next year will certainly make a difference. Thank you very much. At this stage, I'll hand over to our last speaker, my colleague Matthew Tulker.
So good morning, and I'm here as an expert on Europe to talk about China. We are all in our organization having to understand what happens around the world, so hopefully I can bring you some insights. Let's start by looking at the Chinese broader economy. This just gives you a quick view of Chinese growth, segmented into, if you like, primary, secondary, tertiary industries, so production or mining of raw materials, conversion of manufacturing, and the consumption and use of those in the service sector. What's really critical when we look at China is understanding that the growth engine historically has been very much dominated by pure forestry, mining, raw material production and conversion into manufacturing. But as it moves forwards, those areas of growth have reached limitations, and we're seeing much more focus on the tertiary industries, the service sector, retail activity, and other service sector segments. There are big question marks as to whether a very centrally planned economy will be successful at sort of leveraging themselves into those sectors for growth. The next few years will show. But what is critical for us as a chemical industry is that the focus on manufacturing is reducing, but not disappearing. Let's have a little look about some of the dynamics of Chinese base chemical developments. This shows you a view of production capacity additions in China. Quite scary when you look at the scale on the left. China is dominating the build of capacity across all of the petrochemical sectors. When we look at the build of capacity that's been in place since 2020, it's added more capacity in China than is required globally. You add on top of that the additions that we've seen globally, and it really has been a very damaging impact in terms of the market balance. Why is China investing? Well, it's trying to recapture GDP. It's trying to produce more products that it needs itself. It's trying to now support its construction industry, which is reeling from decades of overinvestment in the housing sector, and somewhat stated a global ambition to dominate the petrochemical industry, not just consumption of, but also production of. China has progressed in terms of building capacity, but what it's struggled to do is actually dominate the global industry. And we'll look at some of the reasons why. We are seeing a slowdown in expectations for investment as we move forward. Part of that environmentally driven, but also our view is simply the global market doesn't need more capacity, really very little capacity over the next 10 years versus what China is building. And also we see a challenge for Chinese industries to continue subsidizing and supporting petrochemical asset investment, which is going to see no return. When we look at China and where it sits, and this is where it's good to differentiate the petrochemical sector with some other energy industries and some other manufacturing sectors where China has moved to dominate. China sits with an unenviable position in terms of cost structure. For some product areas, it's less critical. I've shown here a view of ethylene costs, steam cracker by steam cracker, or MTO, CTO unit by CTO unit. And what you see here is that China's cost, even having built the most recent capacity and at significant scale, is sitting with an uncompetitive position, definitely versus the US or the Middle East. But even when we compare it to European assets, we see China with an uncompetitive cost position. And this is really going to be one of the challenges for the Chinese industry moving forward, is it cannot simply dominate the industry just because it has low capital costs, because it doesn't have low operating costs. And so China, we see as a continued importer in these sectors where it doesn't enjoy a significant cost benefit or even cost parity with other producers. But we have seen sectors that have significantly shifted in terms of Chinese trade balances. So here on the left you can see global dynamics for what we call net equivalent trade. This is tracking propylene in the form of derivatives. And there we have seen China investing with a less significant cost disadvantage at a rate far above its requirements. And so we actually see China moving into a net export position for polypropylene, for some of the other derivative sectors. And it's going to be other areas that are going to be the growth engines for imports, particularly India, looking longer term. But then we look at some sectors where China has made huge inroads in reducing its reliance on import, the paraxylene and the polyester chain. But our view is that the Chinese cost position is not competitive enough, and the dynamics around large-scale investments and growth dynamics mean that China will once again move back to being an importer. So the drive towards self-sufficiency in China is challenged. And one of the reasons we see that is when you look at China as a proportion of the base chemical market, it's close to 50% of the global industry. Our view is that it will stabilize around that level, and moving forward it will be other regions, other countries and markets which will dominate the growth in terms of transition. Here I'm showing you India. You can see at the moment still a pretty small proportion, but we see that increasing to 10-15% over the next decades. And when we look at that as a sort of split of growth, we're moving from an environment where China made up something like 75% of demand growth through the first 2 decades of this century, to one where that growth is going to be something like 50, 40, and then 30% of the global demand growth. So still critical, but less critical. But it's worth thinking about this from a perspective of consumption. China does not make up 50% of global retail activity. It does not make up 50% of consumption of goods. It is a huge exporter. And so its aspiration towards self-sufficiency is, if you like, somewhat greedy. Ultimately, it is a huge exporter of converted goods. And its drive to self-sufficiency, if it's met by the similar dynamics in other markets, is ultimately going to hurt the Chinese economy. One other area just to touch on before I finish is some of the dynamics where we do see not just underlying strong growth for Chinese manufacturing, but extreme levels of growth. So 3 sectors One is renewables, so that the hydro, nuclear, and also solar and wind generation. This has been growing at a very quick rate in China. If you look at that black line, you can't see on this chart because I've also added on top of that solar panel manufacturing and also electric car manufacturing. The rate of growth for these products is phenomenal. And what that's doing is driving the Chinese petrochemical industry to say, actually, we don't want to just focus on commodity chemicals, we want to focus on differentiated chemistry. And as a rule of thumb, when China decides to get involved in a specialist or non-commoditized industry, it will be commoditized. And so we see that pressure on some of the special polyolefin sectors, on the metallocene PE. We also see that sector in terms of alpha olefins. And ultimately, we're going to see a commoditization of those sectors. So just to conclude, before I invite my colleagues back up onto the stage, China is rewriting the rules in terms of the petrochemical sector. The level of investment that we see in China, which is being driven by, let's say, non-traditional market rules, is huge. And it's making a massive impact in terms of global trade. It's resulted in an unprecedented excess. We feel the pain of that in Europe. And we see a mix of commoditization, recommoditization, decommoditization as China drives into sectors, but also forces other markets to look at differentiation. But there are limitations. China's competitive position is not that strong in several petrochemical sectors. And there are other players who are also looking at growing their manufacturing base, the emerging markets in Southeast Asia and in India. I'm now going to ask my colleagues to join me on stage. Steve, I think you have some questions for us, and we will move into the panel discussion.
Those presentations, very insightful, a lot of activity going on in a fragmented world and, kind of looking at where we go forward. So I have a few minutes here. We'll start some questions. And I'm going to start with energy because energy really is a driving force into our space in petchems. It's 70% of, the feedstock cost or, a large percentage of the energy requirements in certain value chains. And part of the challenge of being a forecaster is, at the end of the day, you got to draw a line on the graph and supply it to the market. You can't draw 20 or 30 lines because that helps no one. And in those lines comes a lot of assumptions. And Carlo, you presented some things on more oil out of OPEC, demand's a bit softer. We debated internally about interest rates and impacts on demand. Seems like there's potential to have excess oil, but then we have sanctions potentially within Iran and Russia. How as an industry should we think about, the dynamics of oil? Where could it go and implications of some of these other drivers that we're kind of assuming smarter minds prevail, but maybe they don't?
How much time do we have? I guess we have like 15 minutes now. So if you think about the near term, right? When I say near term, I mean the next 2 years. There's definitely spare capacity to supply the world. When you look at sanctions, there's still oil getting out, right? Shadow fleets from Russia, direct purchases by China from Iran. So oil is still getting out, but not to the level that it could if there were no sanctions. So definitely there's some curtailed volumes there. But when you look at OPEC in general, they're definitely going to roll back those voluntary cuts and they'll add more supply to the market. But what I would argue is that they will incrementally add supply until things break. And when I say things break, it's really on the oil price. And we've seen them continuing to add more supply to the market, and oil prices have pretty much taken it like a champ. So really, from a short-term perspective, not much movement on oil, probably slight move downward. But as we move forward, depending on your view of the energy transition, some forecasters would say anywhere between 80 million barrels a day in 2050, all the way up to the OPEC view, which is 130 million barrels a day. We're actually probably closer to the OPEC view at 110 million barrels a day. And that's mostly because of what I mentioned before. There's this entrenched hydrocarbon demand. I think when you have growing populations, yes, like Nick mentioned, population growth is slowing, but it's still growth nonetheless. You have various countries, developing countries around the world that still require hydrocarbon-based fuels so they can move up the socioeconomic ladder. So I think when you look at it and moving forward and having to replace existing barrels that are currently being produced, I mean, we're still going to need oil, we're still going to need development, and interest rates, higher interest rates are just going to make that oil more expensive to bring to market. So, but I guess the key message is, yes, we'll still need oil, and it's just going to be more expensive.
All right, good. Perfect, thanks. Next, I'm going to shift over to Matthew, because energy is important, and what's going on in China is really important, especially regard to capacity. And I just returned from China, or I just arrived here from China the last week. And an interesting perspective from the Chinese eyes is, well, we've added capacity because we want to be self-sufficient. And, economics notwithstanding, right? So they're building on their view, and they feel everyone else has overbuilt. But the fact of the matter is, they've built. Matthew, how do they manage to do this? I mean, you kind of touched on that. And what's going to pause this? I mean, do we think it's really going to stop? Because that's really important so that we can catch up, I guess, overall.
I think as an industry here in Europe, we hope they're going to stop, but that's not a certainty. I would say just to sort of indicate what's driven the growth. So there is a push to self-sufficiency. This has been clear, but there has also been refocusing within the refining industry in China, so that the limitation on how much crude processing capacity can be built is in place, and effectively refining operators enjoying discounted crudes from Iran, from Russia, have been able to subsidize petrochemical investment because of high refining profitability, but also cheap crude. Those supports are reducing, particularly the refining profitability, but without an outlet for the capital for these big oil companies in China into more refining capacity, into crude production and exploration, etc. They've had to look at chemicals as a solution to keep investing and not to have these pools of cash that they've been building taken away from them. So that's really been one of the drivers. Moving forward, we see a little bit less support coming from the refining world in terms of profitability. And we also see environmental regulations in China, which are likely to make it more difficult for new investments to move forward. And so we may still see continued investment, but it may be at a more modest rate and a little bit more organized as the central government tries to limit the losses. I mean, effectively, a huge amount of capital has been put on the ground, and where that is not cost advantaged, in fact, it's cost disadvantaged, you don't become self-sufficient, you just become wasteful in terms of capital expenditure.
All right, good, thank you. Now I'm going to shift to Duncan, just kind of get European-centric here. And we're just the messenger in this message, and we're kind of reporting data as we see it. Unfortunately, that's the way we call it. And when I travel, I remind people, there's a story about two campers in the woods and a bear coming at them. And one of the campers stalls and ties his tennis shoes on, and the other camper says, well, why are you doing that? And he says, you can't outrun the bear. And he says, well, I don't have to outrun the bear, I have to outrun you. And I think you got to keep a mentality of being competitive in this world, right? You got to be better than the weaker guy, because we need a lot of capacity, though operating rates are low. Duncan, you kind of highlighted two big disadvantages, really. It's about natural gas price and the evolution of that and the scale of assets. I mean, those are big hurdles to overcome. How do you see this, region changing? What are the inflection points? Can we restart shuttered assets? Will we ever stop the imports? Can a technical advantage really bridge or overcome some of the other challenges?
Yeah, I think the natural gas situation is, difficult for Europe. Clearly, we were in a different world relative to when natural gas was coming from Russia. I think even if there was a resolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Carla, maybe you'd comment, but I would be surprised if European governments kind of rush back to expose themselves to the same level of natural gas imports as they had in the past. So I think, you know, from a natural gas price perspective, we're here with a long-term view that's going to be elevated. Obviously, the alternative to that is, you know, more sustainable energy. And I think the challenge there is just the cost of that transition. There was a report by, you know, Mario Draghi, the former ECB president last year, which I think highlighted that even for some of these energy-intensive industries like chemicals, you know, there's literally hundreds of billions of dollars required to decarbonize the chemical sector's energy. So, you know, the industry is not in a position where it can afford that right now. In terms of scale, again, I think very challenging for base petrochemicals, you know, because the market size is fragile and the imports are quite strong. Rightly so, I think the European Commission is looking at trades more carefully in terms of, you know, unfair trade practices. But it appears to me that Europe probably has to focus on scale for some of the new, more specialty sort of end applications for chemicals, you know, the new energy kind of products, where there is currently still a race going on to become, you know, the world leaders. So I think base chemicals is probably in a difficult spot right now. Sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
Just
sorry.
the messenger.
Yes. All right, on to Kaushik, and you talked about VUCA, you know, volatility, uncertainty, complexity. And I don't think this is new to our industry. I learned something from an operator once when I was working in a plant, and he said, you know, today's problems are yesterday's solutions. So, you know, we're always contending. What does our industry need to look at as signposts, you know, in this disruptors and moving forward, you know, commodities, or specialties become commodities if too many people chase it. And how do you see these signposts and, you know, looking for these disruptors going forward?
I think what has changed, actually, you know, disruption is not really new, but what has changed is basically the interconnectedness of the industry, you know. So what we see that a small disruption in the Middle East is having a cascading impact into Europe. And people have to readjust in terms of supply chain, in terms of, you know, purchasing dynamics, in terms of business model and everything. So even though there are definitive moods around the world towards more protectionism, more, you know, onshoring and everything, but I don't see that level of globalization really shifting in a big way. So companies are actually, you know, starting to look at scenarios. So I'll give you a classic example of a company who are in the mobility business. They're making a component. They're a market leader. They had about 25 to 30% market share in one product. And that time, actually, there was a big move about EVs and they were actually exposed in terms of business, almost 95% in one product in a mobility industry. And they saw the sign around 22, 23 that this is going to be a big shift. So they started, you know, planning and sort of diversifying and transforming their businesses. And they moved into other sectors. And now in these 3 years, after a lot of effort, you know, converting their business models from B2B to B2C, re-engineering the process, you know, overall upskilling their employees. Now they have shifted to almost less than 40% in terms of, you know, fuel vehicles. 60% of the business is really coming from other businesses. So the companies are actually very much invested in plastics. They do see a very big future, as I said in my, you know, talk, but they also see the need to be aligned with the changes that are happening in terms of supply chain, in terms of interconnectedness, in terms of disruption, and such things.
Good. Now to Raheel, I think it's important to go back to China because China is really driving a lot in the economy. I think a new 5-year plan's coming out. I think you guys have done some work with the consulting group on that front. What do we see, or what do we expect from this next 5-year plan and really the future of China?
Yeah, I think you know, we've already seen signs. I mean, typically when they do these 5-year plans, they are, they're quite poetic, in terms of how they're communicated. But we've always seen signs that, they do certainly recognise that they need to reduce production at least, if not remove capacity. And we will see, I think, in petrochemicals, rationalization of older capacity. They did something similar with the teapot refineries some time ago, probably about 10 years ago now, where smaller capacity was encouraged to be removed from from the sector. I think the other thing that's important about China is that we look at the economic outlook that we can expect from China, but if there is a recession or a weaker economic outlook for China, then all of this capacity that they've built up, not only in petrochemicals, but in steel, cement, aluminium, EVs, batteries, becomes, domestic demand is going to be lower, which means that all of that capacity, will be looking for export homes. And so the pressures on producers elsewhere in many other sectors will be increased. So I think it's important not just to look at what China will do with respect to the next 5-year plan, but also kind of what the economic outlook for China would be and what the implications could be more globally, really.
Good. And Nick, I'd like to leave with a kind of a glass half full perspective here. And I think the good news, and maybe Carlo alluded to, population is growing. Purchasing power is growing. You showed, definitely consumption per capita of petrochemicals is growing. I mean, demographics, yes, are shifting. You made that clear. I mean, how as an industry do I prepare for this? Because again, we're long lead delivery items, and you showed the troughs and peaks can shift pretty quickly with certain dynamics. If we get a bunch of rationalizations quickly, how as a producer should they be thinking about this and looking forward?
It's interesting, as you're asking that question, I was thinking about sort of my career. I graduated as a chemical engineer 30 years ago, and if you go back then, it was not a good time to be graduating as a chemical engineer in North America. It looked like the petrochemical industry was over. How quickly things can change when you're talking 20, 30, or how drastically they can change when you're talking 20, 30 years. 20 years ago, China wasn't going to be a powerhouse in petrochemicals like they are today. So I think other emerging markets look at China and how successful China has been, and there's opportunity in those regions where demand is growing for chemical capacities to increase, to try and copy the China model. I would have said, oh, that's highly unlikely 10 years ago. I'd say the cost advantage, the build-to-export model is the only model that will be successful. But no, I think there is opportunity for growth in these emerging markets. So yes, today, Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, let's go 10, 20 years, Africa could be the next frontier. So I think the world will evolve. Where that capacity is put in place will evolve as well with it.
I mean, the one thing that I would add, Steve, on that is to give some good news or some semblance of good news.
Please.
In the refining industry, I mean, we saw low margins and really tough margins for a sustained period of time in the 90s. But those refiners that were able to hang on and increase the efficiencies of their plants and debottleneck to really lower their per unit costs, they actually came out on the back end, came out stronger and really took advantage of the golden age of refining in the early 2000s, largely driven by fuels demand growth. So we've been talking about continued growth in the chemical sector and continued growth in chemical demand. And so for those producers that can hang on, there's light at the end of the tunnel. It's just the tunnel's really far away.
Perfect. Yeah, we're at the end of time, but I just want to remind everyone, we do draw a line, but we have a lot of assumptions behind the data that we're forecasting. And we're across the street in the Pullman Hotel in the Bazell Room. Our experts are here. We're happy to talk through our assumptions and why we think the way we think. You know, it's all about assumptions, and we're happy to share. Please come visit us and take some time. We appreciate you sticking with us today. You know, thanks to the speakers. We covered a lot of ground, but it's a tough world, rebalancing in the environment we're in, but we got to, you know, continue to look forward in the new kind of world we're going to live in. And, you know, we're a good industry. We're chemistry. We do a lot of great things. So thanks.